One of the challenges of getting older is, especially if in our industry where we spend a lot of time working up close with monitors, generally the eyes work really well up here, and they're a problem for distance. So I'm glad we've got something up here that might allow me to see this. So today I actually want to talk a little bit about some concepts and principles, not digging so much into the technology. Most of us here are probably very involved with the technology itself. But the success of technology is not necessarily dependent on the actual technology itself. It's all the things that go around that and manages the life cycle of the technology that needs to be taken into account. Now, I did talk a little bit about this last year. I was fortunate to have an opportunity to speak at the PrimeKey Tech Days last year, and I spoke a little bit about this, and I am continuing that theme a little bit more today, and I'm going to be using as a backdrop the experience that we have had at DarkMatter. DarkMatter is the company that I work for. It's a private organisation that does cybersecurity. It's based in the United Arab Emirates. My role there, as Admir pointed out, I head up the trust services, and one of the key missions for the establishment of the Trust Services Division at DarkMatter was for the establishment of the national PKI for the United Arab Emirates. And as part of that process, one of our key partners in that process has been PrimeKey. And so the principles that I'm talking about today of how to have a secure implementation and what we need to think about for a system that needs to exist long term and will actually deliver on the goal of what it was put in place. Because for those of us that run PKIs, we establish routes that have to be around for perhaps decades. We're talking about how do we plan that far in advance when we know that things are happening and changing so rapidly today. How can we stay on top of that curve, and how can we plan for the future in such a way that what we deliver was the end goal, and how do we keep that end goal in mind? Now, of course, the end goal that I'm talking about today is happiness. And happiness of our clients, happiness of our employers, etc. And I'm fortunate enough, I've been living in the UAE now for about 3 years. And one of the interesting things about the United Arab Emirates is they actually have, in the government, a Ministry of Happiness. And the focus of the Ministry of Happiness is to establish those programs that will ensure the happiness of the citizens, the residents, and the visitors to the UAE. And I know that when that announcement was made for the Ministry of Happiness, some of my colleagues who don't live in the UAE maybe snickered a little bit behind their jackets, etc., about what does this mean. But actually, I've seen some great things come out of that, and having a focus on what the end goal is. What the real end goal here is actually to achieve a better life for the community that lives in the UAE. I think it's a good goal, and actually executing on that goal is actually bringing about some fruits that have been interesting to see. So the things that I want to run through, and I'm sorry, because it doesn't necessarily play here on the screen, I'm going to have to refer up here. So we're going to talk about a principle-based approach to technology, which hopefully is going to deliver on the end goal of happiness. We'll talk about trust, and that is really where I will continue the theme that I talked about last year. We'll talk about a key element of a framework that enables trust to be established, and then some other key principles that have to come into play. And again, I'm only listing 3 key principles here. The second one that I'm listing is agility, and then finally purpose. And again, the end goal, the purpose is to achieve happiness, I guess. And then I'll try and summarize some things at the end. So for starters, a principle-based approach to technology. I think I quoted this last year. This comes from an Egyptian philosopher. And I've made one modification now, because what we're trying to create with technology is not just wealth, but the end goal of hopefully what wealth produces. Wealth doesn't always produce happiness, but I think really happiness is what we really want to produce by generating wealth. Technology plays a key part, but not just technology and not only technology. So, what does it mean to have a principle-based approach? And by the way, even though I'm talking about PKI and using the lessons learned from PKI, I've tried to generalize this so that we could apply this to any technology that you might be dealing with in terms of an implementation, using the lessons learned from PKI. So anybody who's running a publicly trusted PKI today is probably already applying many of these principles that I'm going to talk about today, or have at least a principle-based approach because of the very nature of the way in which PKIs are operated and governed within those communities of trust. So what does it mean? We want to have a set of principles that drive your technology implementations and your deployments, and they get updated in such a way that that set of principles manages the end goal, which hopefully is happiness. So the future success is also measured, or can also be measured, by these principles as well. So not only are they a guiding way of how we want to get there, but they're also perhaps a yardstick that we can use to measure how well we're doing in getting there. So the three principles that I want to talk about are trust, agility, and purpose. Now, when we talk about trust, and here's the element where we'll spend a bunch of time about technology, because the technology is a core component of trust, but it is not the only component of trust. Agility and being able to be resilient in an era and in an environment where there is constant change, being able to cater for that, plan for that where possible, and respond to that. And then purpose, making sure that you stay on track with what the end goal or purpose of the technological implementation is. So number one, the importance of trust. And I am very aware that I am probably the only thing between you and lunch. So if I run through this quickly, hopefully that'll create some happiness amongst the community here. Trust actually is an extremely critical component to achieving happiness. If you don't have an environment of trust, it's extremely difficult to achieve a state of happiness. So if the technology that we're deploying is not able to establish an environment of trust, then it's going to be very hard to reach that end goal of, hey, I'm happy with the way that I interact with technology or service or whatever it is that we're providing. So a quick review of what I mean by trust. This is my definition, that it's the confidence or assurance that a person, system, or thing will behave exactly as you expect. You do exactly what you say you're going to do. Or alternatively, that it actually behaves in a way that benefits you. Now, the interesting thing about trust is I believe that it's a choice. And by saying that trust is a choice, that generally means we are talking about some interaction of a human or some sentient being that has the capability of making choices. So when we talk about trust, there is a huge part of, or a key or critical part that is actually the human element in that. And so it's a choice that we make based on information we have about the behavior of that system, that thing, or the individual. Business occurs at the speed of trust. So one thing that we have learned from experience, that as soon as, if you're trying to engage in a business transaction, it will not occur if there's no trust between the two parties that are trying to do business. As soon as there is trust, then the transaction will occur. So what we need is a consistent and standardized protocols that enable interoperability between systems to be established, and then people, when they are dealing with either a system or an individual that they have experience with, that's the point that they become ready to move forward and perhaps take a risk on some transaction that they're engaged in. So, trust is the most critical aspect of any communications or business transaction. And as I said before, technology can never achieve this by itself. There's always a number of things that have to come into play before trust can be established. It's not possible to go get something, plug it in, say, there you go, I've just added trust to my system. If you have that approach, you're going to generally find that there are going to be elements of establishing that transaction and over the long term that will actually fail, and they will have nothing to do with the technology. I know that Ryan was mentioning earlier, even in the PKI industry, there were some spectacular failures back in like 2011, etc. But the interesting thing about those failures is it wasn't actually the technology that failed. The technology did exactly what it was meant to do. So you could, one aspect, say from a technological perspective, it was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, it was trusted. But what did fail was the policies and processes around how that technology was supposed to be used and when it should be used and how it should be used. And so these are the elements that we have to take into account when we're dealing with any technology. So in order for trust to be enabled, we have to couple it with a couple of things, policies and procedures, I say, and then also the participants in any transaction have to have a clear understanding of what their role is, what their responsibilities, what their liabilities are. Unless all of those aspects are taken into account, you don't actually establish trust. So this is one that I probably showed last year. It's one that I've been preaching about for a long time, and I think there are the three aspects. There's the technology and the tokens, there's the policies and procedures, and the relationships and responsibilities. And if you solve all of those pieces and you have a methodology or a framework that allows them all to work together, you do actually, or you can actually, on a consistent basis, establish an environment where there is trust and then business transactions occur. So as I said before, again, this is probably one that I've showed lots of times, lots of places. I think the framework that goes into implementing a real public key infrastructure. And by public key infrastructure, I'm not just talking about the technology. Anybody can grab a EJBCA, put it on a server, put it on the desk and say, there you go. You know, I've got some technology running. But that doesn't actually achieve trust. You've got to have all those other things. And if you do those in the way in which it was designed by PKI, I think the guys who envisioned how this should all operate together and published RSC 3647 were actually quite groundbreaking in what they did. It has actually stood the test of time. It's been around for decades. And yes, we have had some failures, like I said before, in some public key infrastructures, but it wasn't because of the technology. It was because processes that were defined were not followed. So PKIs are a great example of what it means. They actually are a good example of what we want to base where we should look to get a clue about how we're going to achieve results a long way down the road in terms of time, because they themselves have stood the test of time, I believe. So what is the formula that they used? It's this one, P cubed. So the policy, the practice, procedure, these are levels of an implementation that need to be taken into account. And again, by default, a PKI does this if you implement it appropriately, and any other technology can follow the same pattern, and you would or should expect to get similar results. So RSC 3647 was the format. There it was posted. It describes CPs and CPSs. RPSs are more of a new thing that are focused practices around which an RA would enter into that are a part of that process. That RSC has been around for a long time. It probably needs a facelift. But interestingly enough, if we take a look at what the contents are in there, I think it probably covers all the major areas. And there's probably not too much that we need to update or edit in there. Although if anybody's interested in doing that, I'm probably in the very near future about to put my hand up for some activity like that in IETF if anybody wants to join me. So, in that policy process, there are 9 areas that are outlined. And these are the things that we need to think about. And you will notice if you look at the list that they're not all focused on technology. In fact, there's only 1 or 2 that really have a high technological content. So, maybe 1/3 of what you need to do needs to be about managing the technology. The other 2/3 takes in those other aspects that I talked about of procedures and processes and of the liabilities and the way in which the relationships need to be understood, handled, managed, and operated. So the 9 particular areas, we have an outline of what the purpose of the PKI is going to be used for, who the participants are, and how the PKI is going to be governed. This is important. It actually sets the foundation and understanding for any community that's going to rely upon it, what exactly is trying to be achieved. So there's not a disconnect in terms of scope and what it is that we are trying to do. Then you have information about where you can get information of the system, how to interact with the system, etc., the repositories that are available. That's in section 2. Then it talks about identity and authentication. So these are key aspects for trust. Generally speaking, you know, when we do business with somebody, we are more likely to have a faster time to closure in terms of trust and for that transaction to go forward if we're dealing with somebody that we know. Now, for me, the last 3 years in the UAE is very interesting in terms of the way that business occurs there. It still happens pretty much the old-fashioned way, and that is they like to sit down across the table from somebody, be able to look you in the eye, size you up, and understand whether what you're telling them is truth. So the challenge that the UAE has is how to take that mechanism and that culture of doing business in that manner and translate this now to I'm sitting down at some device and how am I going to transact business across the world with some entity that I've never met before. This is actually a change in culture that is occurring, and it is a challenge that they're taking on board and seeking to find the solutions to. Now, I think the National PKI, well, I know that the National PKI is core to their strategy there. We're yet to see whether they're able to realise the benefits of what we're doing. It's still an experiment, if you like. We're headed in all the right directions, but we'll see what comes out of the sausage maker at the end of the day. And then, now we start talking about the artifacts and tokens of the systems and how they're used, how they get issued, etc. Some of the cranking of the handle of things that actually occur. And then we talk about facilities and trusted roles and operations and what happens there. And again, for those of you who do publicly trusted PKIs, this is very familiar. For those of you who may have a lot of experience with enterprise PKIs, you may not be familiar with some of these things because, quite honest, I mean, I have been doing PKI for too long. And my experience with enterprise PKIs, just about, well, 100% basically of all enterprise PKIs that I've had an opportunity to work with, where there was an enterprise PKI in place and there was a need of some assistance to get it to achieve what it was meant to achieve. In 100% of the cases, it really is, you know, I got my EJBCA code base, I whacked it on a server, I stuck it under the desk, and that's my PKI. So none of the concepts of the policies and processes, none of the concepts of the roles and responsibilities were taken into account. And simply by addressing those, we almost solved all of the issues in every case. Sometimes there were some technological things that obviously also need to be addressed as well. So 6 is where you get into the security controls and infrastructure, and then the profiles that you're going to use in 7, audit and assessment in 8. This is also critical in terms of transparency, especially if those audits are made available for the relying parties in the trust community to be able to consume. And then finally, the business and legal considerations also need to be taken into account. So the CP, that's where you specify policies. The CPS, that's where you specify practices, and these are actually levels. And I think, yeah. So there is actually a 3-tiered system that you should implement for any technology. You should specify what the policies are and what the end goal is that you're trying to achieve. And you can use the same framework, and this is what PKIs use, of course, to specify now, okay, well, what practices am I going to implement that meets all of these policies that we've specified? And those top two, the policies and the practices, really should be for public consumption, at least within the trust community that you're seeking to run your trust services in. And then finally, we have a level that goes below that, and these are your standard operating procedures. These are generally only meant for internal eyes. Maybe you might let an auditor see some of those, etc., under an NDA, etc. But they are meant to be done in such a way that anybody who needs to step into that organisation could actually look at that SOP and know exactly what they need to do, and the system continues to function. Right? So that's how detailed they need to be, as opposed to the other two are generally relatively high level. So if we want to generate the same type of success in terms of establishing trust that PKIs have managed to do over a long period of time, we should adopt a similar architecture for any implementation of any technology, and also even for enterprise PKI. Let's make sure that we have a CP. Let's ensure that we have a practice statement, and let's ensure that there are actually SOPs. And anybody who does that and has an organisation that's committed to things like ISO audits will be very grateful for having put the effort into documenting all of these things and knowing and understanding where the potential for issues might come with your technology. So if we generalise that, I think there's an A, B, and C. So for any implementation of the technology, you create the policy document, and that policy document should address all of those same areas that are covered in RFC 3647. There's 9 of them. Here I've generalised them, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through those. But basically, there should at least be those 9, and maybe in an upcoming version of an RFC, maybe it might expand to 10, or maybe we might update some of these or combine some of these, because it is, over time, some of these have become less critical in terms of prominence, and maybe shouldn't be in their own section, but there might be a more logical way to group these that makes it also easier to audit, by the way. So, at the second level, B, then you create your practice statements that details how you're going to do all of those policies that have been laid out. And again, that should be aimed for public consumption. And then finally, your detailed SOPs. Now, it is important to have these, especially if you're trying to prove to some third party that you are consistently doing something. If you're consistently doing something, you should have it documented exactly what it is that you're doing. And if you're going to establish trust, remember, trust is always getting the same response, or always doing exactly what is expected. So you have to specify what it is that's expected and then actually consistently do it and be able to prove it. So this 3 level is actually a great framework for trust. PKIs have been doing it for a long time. Policy, practice, and procedures. What comes out of that are some key aspects for establishing trust. For one, I wonder if this thing works. Oh, it does, look. Transparency. So transparency of the responsibility in the organisations are important. We heard Ryan talking this morning about the role that transparency is playing in the artefacts that come out of public PKIs. But transparency as part of the process of running any PKI it's a key tenet of security. So security is woven into the operations because you have policies, and then you have procedures, and then you have all of your practices that, your policy, your practices, then all of your procedures that implement that. And then it can be verified by an audit and then published for public consumption. And when the community has this information at hand, they know exactly how you're going to operate, you're actually setting expectations, and as long as you follow those, you actually establish trust. And entities that follow this can establish trust very quickly between unknown parties and will keep trust for a long time. If an entity doesn't follow this and they deviate from this, you can actually fail spectacularly. We could probably ask Dan, if he's around, how the transition from semantic to DigiCert is going, because that's an example of where an entity that was very large did not actually follow their processes. And there are massive consequences as a result for the previous community that was relying upon them. So, when it comes to trust in technology, these three elements of that transparency of what the operations are and what it is that you're doing, the security that is a key part of everything that you're doing, and audit that verifies all of this, are key elements of that principle of trust. If you can establish all those three, and I'm suggesting that the framework, the three-tiered framework of policy, practice, and procedures, if you follow those, and you have the scope covered in terms of what was laid out, at least as a blueprint, RFC 3647 or something similar to that, then you are actually able to achieve and accomplish all these three elements and establish trust. Trust is a key principle. The next one, the next principle that we need to address is agility. So, at the end of the day, we want to get to the end goal of happiness. So, if you've got a trusted operations, that's great, but if we set up our trusted operations to cater for this environment, and 3 days later that environment is now something vastly different that we're dealing with, we need to be able to handle that. We need to have resilient systems. And so when we plan our technologies, we have to plan the ability to be able to change. Change with threats, change with different use cases, change with different actors who come in. All of these things, some of these things you can't plan ahead, but you should have a pattern for how you're going to deal with that. And so this is another key principle for being able to plan for long-term success of the implementation of any technology, is to recognize and know that the only constant thing is change. And if you have a system that is agile, and there's some key components that I'm going to talk about what we might want to look at, then these are the things that can help us actually, if we apply the principle of agility, they will help us ensure that whatever we have implemented actually lasts for as long as we want it to. So even the IETF has started addressing some of these, especially with algorithms, etc., that are now considered weak, and being able to build things into a TLS library, for instance, that allows update of algorithms, etc. A lot of that is now a core principle of what gets standardized for internet-based technologies anyway. So if we're dealing with any technology, we should take a similar approach and ensure that we have perhaps modular code, and prepare for the fact that some algorithms are not going to be able to stand the test of time. We've got post-quantum computing knocking on the door. There's a lot of organizations that are doing research in this area, my own organization being one of them, because if there are effective systems that become widely available, then a lot of the technology that we are currently using, for instance, for public key infrastructure, is going to have to change radically in terms of algorithms that need to be supported. And a lot of things that we thought when we put it together 10 years ago, well, that's going to be secure for another 20 years, will be instantly open for everybody to see. And that is a constant threat that is hanging over our heads. We have to have plans of how we're going to deal with that. So having a way of updating those algorithms is important. So, having modular services where it's easy to take things in and out. You've got to have hooks in the right place that makes it easy to do this. Now that's easier said than done, but it actually is a core architecture that we have to build into the code base that underlies the technologies that we're using. Another interesting thing that we should take into account is that a lot of us, for our cryptographic services, if I use that as the example here, are relying on perhaps a small number of vendors who are providing libraries that provide those services. Now, it's in the best interests of those library vendors to keep us dependent, because that keeps the cash flow rolling, right? So one way to mitigate the risk of being locked into a vendor and perhaps being held hostage by a vendor, and I say that because for many years we used to have a number of HSM vendors, and now we're down to, there's been quite a lot of consolidation. Now we're down to very few, right? It's in the hands of a very few, and it's a critical piece of hardware and infrastructure that's needed for trust services to run. And I have worked in a number of places where a HSM vendor basically no longer being able to provide services for one reason or another has left the customer high and dry. Now, the purpose of most vendors of code, or just using HSMs as an example in terms of hardware, is again, they want to hold on to their customers. But for long term, in the environment in which we live, it's interesting to note that a lot of the organizations for the company that I work for, we've been approached to become maybe not the number one provider of certain services, but they want us to be the backup provider for a number of services because they're trying to mitigate their risk of being locked in for one type of service to a single vendor. Now, we do this all the time when we're deploying technology. We make it highly available and we put in redundancy to ensure that if something goes down, we can still operate. Well, businesses are wising up to the fact for the services, the trust services that we're providing, that you need to do the same thing. Now, another way, besides having multiple vendors in your trust stack, is also to ensure that you just use open source code in terms of the things that you're deploying, right? So it's something that a lot of people have a look at. So open standards or open source code is another way of mitigating that risk, so that if something goes wrong, sure, if I've got somebody who's managing this piece of code for me or helping me manage this piece of code for me, and that vendor goes away, it's open source code. There's still a large community out there that knows how to deal with this code that I can turn to if I haven't already built up the resources in-house to deal with it myself. It's another strategy for being agile in the way in which you want to respond to changes that can happen in the marketplace for the set of services that you're relying upon. The other one is interoperability. So you want to look for some type of partner. If you're going to use partners in your deployment process, you want to look for somebody who has a strategy of focusing on interoperability and industry standards. Because again, you're going to be mitigating this risk of being locked in and stuck with one particular thing, which when it no longer works, you no longer have a trusted or working solution. So looking for a vendor, if that's the approach that you're using, that is focused on interoperability and uses whatever the standard industry practices are for the technology that you're using. These are key principles that will help you to have an implementation and a partner that is agile enough to be able to handle the changes that are going to come. So, an open source CA platform, that sounds very familiar for our hosts in PrimeKey. Somebody who's committed to innovation so that they're constantly evolving and staying up with the trends that are occurring. Another key, again, I can tip my hat to our hosts who also do that. Interoperability, all of these. So this is actually one of the core reasons that DarkMatter chose PrimeKey as our technology partner for our CA platform. It's because they were committed to these principles, and we could see that they demonstrated that over time. And that principle of being agile enough to handle, and we had a desire to do, and we still do have a desire to do some innovative things in the market, so we want to make sure that we're choosing a partner who is agile enough to move with us in terms of the things that we want to do and are willing to try new things. The other aspect that is also key there is because the environment in which we operate in is constantly changing, threats are changing, the threat actors and who they are and where they're coming from is constantly changing, evolving. You're generally getting worse in terms of if you're trying to defend systems, it's getting worse. The resources behind those that are on the attack side of things are increasing, and it's typically they're more well-funded, more well-organized, and so it becomes harder and harder to stay ahead of that curve in terms of defending what you're putting in place. So a key strategy to mitigate that is to ensure that whatever you put in place today, know that that's not status quo. You have to understand that you also, yourself, you need to become your best attacker. You need to be poking and prodding your systems. You need to be trying to find out, look, if I'm the attacker and I'm trying to break something here, what am I going to do it? And you should have a constant cycle of evaluation, whether you rely on third parties or you have somebody in-house to do that. You should always be doing this. A number of years ago, I was at Dartmouth College, and we had an initiative, we called it Dartmouth Csi. And Dartmouth Csi was the Cybersecurity Initiative, and we basically took some postgrad students and some engineers and even some high school students, and we trained them in certain techniques after they had been through an ethics course and signed their life away to us. And we used them basically as ethical hackers on campus. And I was amazed that in such a short period of time we were able to uncover things that were a problem right under our noses. Now, we could have paid a lot of money to perhaps have some third party come in and do that, but we had those resources. It was part of curriculum for a certain course that ran on campus, etc. And it was a very successful program. And by running that program, we were able to get ahead of a lot of challenges. We worked closely, one of the major sponsors of the program was the IT department, so we worked closely with them to actually make the adjustments necessary. And so that experience, when I left Dartmouth and went back to the public CA world, I took that with me, and I've advocated that for everything we do. So in one of the core principles that we apply at DarkMatter is that we constantly test and prod our own infrastructure to ensure that what we have in place is doing what we expect. Now, we're fortunate that as part of the DarkMatter group, we also have the contract to run the national labs for the UAE, so we can call on some good resources there to help us with that. But that has been a core component of, and is a core component of, our existing platform and anything else that we bring in. We don't release anything until we've put it through the ringer, so to speak, as the PrimeKey guys know. And it turns out great too for vendors, because it's basically like a free security assessment, and they get to see, hey, this could be a challenge. And generally, okay, I will admit the first response that we typically get from vendors is, whoa, I don't want to put my stuff through that. I want to know myself before anybody else finds out. But usually it ends up pretty well. So finally, use cases. Use cases will expand also. And so when use cases expand, then the way in which we deal with those also need to be taken into account. So again, there needs to be agility around how you do that. And typically, that will mean ensuring that your partner is plugged into whatever the production roadmap, product roadmap is, etc. And again, this is another thing that our hosts do really, really well in terms of inviting their clients to participate in that. They have all the flags for, well, at least they're ticking all the boxes for me, anyway. So again, what are the three elements that need to be considered for the principle of agility? Modular open source standards, a commitment to interoperability and ongoing innovation in a collaborative manner, and then periodic and proactive security evaluations. Finally, purpose, and I'll run quickly. So, at the end of the day, we're trying to get to happiness. We have to realize that that is the end goal. So how do we do that? We have to always evaluate what we've got deployed as to, is it actually going to get us to that at the end of the day? Because I have been involved in a lot of projects where so much resources were committed to the project that the management was not willing to change the course and take it to the completion, yet they realized 3/4 of the way through it wasn't going to get them where they wanted to be. Sometimes you just have to cut your losses and realize that the end goal, the purpose, is what you really need to be aiming for, and not worry about your pride of, hey, I made an error by choosing this path. I just need to correct and get there. So, if we go back to relationships, unmet expectations is the biggest indicator of unhappiness, basically. So, in order to avoid having unmet expectations in our technological implementations, we need to ensure that we clearly articulate the purpose and proper use of the technology. And so that requires good documentation, and you have to have well spec'd out use cases that you're dealing with. And again, this is something that our hosts here are really good at doing. There also needs to ensure that there, as I said before, forums or channels to be able to provide feedback on those use cases. So effective customer-aligned party community engagement is critical, however that happens, however you make that effective. And actually this gathering is really a key part of doing that also for PrimeKey. So communication is the key to success in any relationship. And you have to make sure that there is an ongoing dialogue. And when you find a point where dialogue has slowed down between you and your partners, that could be the first sign that there's a problem on the horizon. You want to make sure that that is ongoing, engaged, and vibrant all the time. So if we look at the principle of purpose, what are the aspects that need to be considered? Detailed documentation, use case-driven feedback channels, and periodic evaluation of outcomes. Are you actually going where you think or want to go? So to summarize, technology is great and can be a great tool in creating happiness if we do it right. To do it right, we can take a principle-based approach for something that needs to exist long-term. And the three principles that I believe we should focus on are trust in the technology that we're deploying, the agility, and paying attention to what the purpose of the program is. Again, summarizing under trust, it's the transparency, the security, and audit of the 3P, right? The policy, the practices, and the procedures. Then on agility, modular and open source, standards-based, commitment to interoperability and ongoing innovation, and then periodic and proactive security evaluations. You got to take the lead. And then finally, on purpose, have detailed documentation, use case-driven feedback channels, and then periodically have points where you're checking to see, am I actually heading in the direction that I think I'm going? Is this actually going to get me where I need it to be? Do I need to change horses? All of these questions have to be asked on an ongoing and constant basis. So, all of these reasons are why DarkMatter chose PrimeKey as a partner for one aspect of technology that we believe has the capability to transform the way in which business occurs in the Middle East, not just in the UAE itself. And so far, we have not been disappointed, and everything's heading in the right direction. That's it. Any questions?
Thank
1
you very
minute
much
for question,
your
that's
kind
all.
words. Yeah, we do have a question. So it's actually quite interesting observation, I would say. So it says states that for the humans, we still don't seem to have a provable behavior from, say, existing documentation, and contraposing it to we have for some code generating probably correct algorithms or specifications when it comes to cryptography. To me, it seems like you are touching on it very deeply, because without this element of trust between us humans, we might not be able to achieve the happiness.
Well, it's interesting, because part of the enjoyment of life is actually the experience, and sometimes we do need to focus on the journey and not get wrapped up around what we think might be the end goal, because by the time we get there, it's actually maybe not where we are, but rather who we have become. So in relation to that comment, there are things that are helping us to be better at documenting the way in which things should be implemented. There are tools and there are systems that are being worked on research. I was involved for some time with a PhD student out of Dartmouth that continued on past my life there, where we were looking at ways of being able to, from a machine perspective, provably implement a lot of the 3 Ps up there, the policy, the practices, and the SOPs. But again, there is always so far that you can go, because at the end of the day, I come back to the statement that I made earlier, that trust is what we want to achieve. Trust is one of those things that has to exist for happiness to be achieved, and that means you're going to have people involved. And the beauty of having people involved is they're unpredictable. But that is also one of the blessings, because I know that in technology we want everything to happen the same, etc., etc., etc. But if we work on some principles and we work on this knowledge that security is like a continuum, right? We can have no security and 100% usable at this end, or we can have 100% security at this end and no usability. Nobody's going to use it. The challenge, the art of doing business is finding where in that continuum you're prepared to operate, where you can control everything up to this point and you know it well, and recognize that from here to here you have to have a plan and you have to execute on the plan, and understand that that is a risk that has to be managed, and it's risk that has to be managed, and that's it, and it's a people thing that has to occur.
Thank you. Did we have some more questions, or are you so hungry, ladies and gentlemen? And I again apologize, I'm not maybe updating this so currently. So there is somebody who almost asked a personal question. Scott, is your happiness theme related to the philosophy being adopted by UAE leadership? The much I know you had this philosophy even before, I would dare say.
I did have this philosophy before I went to the UAE. And the fact that I ended up in the UAE, I think, was more of an alignment of the fact of where I was as an individual and where that country wanted to go. I mean, the company that I worked for recruited me to go there, and it seemed like a good fit. So I don't think, I'm not naive enough to think that my philosophy, which I've been, sprouting for a long time, was something that is influencing the nation. It was more of a recognition that we had alignment of, I happen to be a practitioner that was experienced in the services that they need, and they were already there. And having said that, however, there is a very constructive, ongoing dialogue at many levels to talk about the philosophy and how important that actually is to achieving the end goal of happiness. So we don't sit around and just talk about technology, we don't sit around and talk about policies and processes. The human aspect is actually considered, and it's actually one of the more enjoyable aspects of the job that I currently have.
Thank you. So knowing you really know your technology deep and great. I would just love to kind of end it up on a little joke. Not only that you know your technology, but we could call you a little bit like Dalai Lama or PKI?
Never. Never.
Happiness.
All of us, we're in a boat together, and we're sailing this sea that we're trying to negotiate, and we're have an opportunity to come up against challenges all the time, and to get through to the other side, the end goal, the happiness, it's actually going to take the community. It needs all of us to work together, and there is today, thanks to Google, by the way, who led the way in this path, today it's not so much the people who are the icons who may have been in this industry for a long time, who are the subject matter experts that people turn to. I don't think we have so much of that today, because we have tools that Google's pioneered that, those that are leading or guiding or directing or hoping to do that really just need to know where to look or where to turn or where to search so that you can find those tools. And no one of us knows everything, and we'll only really get to the other side of this journey if we leverage all the collective experience of everybody there, so that what we end up with is actually synergistic. It's greater than any one individual, but it's something that we've all contributed to together. And to be a part of that is something that motivates me every day, anyway.
Thank you, Scott, for reminding us of some of the more softer levels of working in this as well.
Thanks,